Let's talk to Candice Holdsworth. She is a writer and broadcaster. So much around today that I want Candice's wise thoughts on. Perhaps we will start with that mental health question, actually, Candice, in regard to all these teenagers, double the number on something called personal independence payment than before the lockdowns. And we know that there has been so much harm to so many people that has happened in the last number of years. What's your reaction to this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I don't know if you're right, if it's more to do with the lockdown or if it's something to do with parenting styles, which we've discussed before, where children are very protected and they become a lot less resilient. I kind of feel like it's difficult to work out which one it is because none of us went through something like that at their age.
Could it be both, Candice?
It's possible, but sometimes I think that we focus too much on how the individual's dealing with things, and sometimes we don't examine their circumstances enough. And I think that when you're going through a period of real growth and development at, say, the age of 17, 18, and suddenly you're locked in your house, you don't get to meet all the same milestones that many people meet at that age, it could have an inhibiting effect that maybe we don't understand very well. Maybe we need, what I would not say is that they should just be placed on benefits and left on the scrap heap. And I think that that's such an issue that people are just being signed off. Maybe we need to acknowledge the effect that lockdown had on that generation and find some way of helping them through it. Because like that text message you got from that lady, that was such wise news. They must think of 50-year-old them. How will 50-year-old them look back on the decisions that they made when they were in their 20s?
It's a very, very fair point. Should say the White House is having a press briefing at the moment. We will keep across that. I know that the producers behind the scenes are making sure that if anything comes out of that we need to bring you, we will tell you. That is just happening at the moment. It happens basically every day, but if there's news happening specifically in regard to Ukraine and what Donald Trump is doing, we know that he is meeting Emmanuel Macron and indeed Keir Starmer in the next few days or so. We know that Nigel Farage as well has made his views clear. A lot of people wondering what they were. And he says that Zelensky is not a dictator. He says that Donald Trump should be taken seriously, but not literally. What do you make of that, Candice?
Yeah, that's the famous line from the journalist Selena Zito. She said, Donald Trump's fans take him seriously, but not literally, but his opponents take him literally, but not seriously. What I would say is I just think that those comments were unacceptable. I mean, it's not what you expect from a US president, and it's not what he should be doing when going into a negotiation like this. I mean, I don't think that you can call yourself an honest broker if you've already tried to delegitimize one of the people who has serious interest in these negotiations.
Also, I mean, my point, I'm probably more with Trump than you are on this particular issue, but on that specific thing, I think, if Zelensky's a dictator, what's Putin? I mean, Putin's not exactly Mr. Democracy, is he?
No, he isn't. Look, I'm sure Zelensky is far from perfect. He's an imperfect person thrown into extraordinary circumstances and trying to survive. And I'm sure he's made questionable decisions along the way, like everybody does.
Well, there's a heck of a lot of corruption in Ukraine, which is very much not examined by many people who seem to believe that Zelensky is, the Messiah.
That's the thing. So we shouldn't be having a debate like that. You're so right. Like, I am all for just having a very sort of fact-based, evidence-based debate about Ukraine, Zelensky. I suppose what I don't like is when it all goes a bit adrift of common sense and facts, and it starts becoming a little bit conspiratorial. And, I think I have seen that amongst some who are skeptical of the Ukraine war, which is a completely legitimate position. But there are people who start getting that Zelensky is uniquely evil in some way. And, he's manipulative. And, you've seen some of that as well with some on the right who are very skeptical of the whole post-war liberal order. And then they start saying that Churchill was a baddie as well. Some of their positions on things, I just don't think are legitimate or right in any way. And I think that's why, Trump's position jarred even amongst people who support him, because it just doesn't seem quite right.
Yes, indeed. I think it's a very fair analysis of that. Let's bring it back to the UK, because we have heard today a story about an asylum seeker who has been declared a child by UK judges, despite the fact he is 23 years old. He has a receding hairline and thick facial hair. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but that sounds to me like, what's that word? Oh yes, an adult.
Yeah. And sadly, this has been going on for a while. And I've said this before, but it represents a huge safeguarding risk. I mean, he was placed in children's accommodation.
Yeah. Well, for people in schools and on accommodation, as you say, it's it's a very motivating thing to say, well, actually, I'm a child, because then you get all sorts of privileges in the way that you're dealt with. But it's not true, and it is a massive safeguarding issue, as you say.
Yes, and I think what's going on now is we're sort of seeing a clash between what people think is human rights law, which has also become a little bit, not a little bit, but quite a lot adrift of common sense. I mean, it's very important that people have access to lawyers. And, you know, if people were trying to deny asylum seekers access to legal representation, I would disagree with that. But it's sometimes the broadest, most nonsensical interpretations of human rights law that apply to people that can't get criminals jailed, for instance, or that says 23-year-old is a child.
And let's talk about that in just a second, but particularly this Sudanese immigrant, he's had the decision that he's not a 16-year-old teenager overturned by immigration judges in a recent tribunal, and will therefore be considered a child on his asylum application. As you say, you know, you personally have no problem with people getting some legal representation. Well, I agree with you to an extent, but also his own legal bills, specifically on whether he's a child or not, which he factually is not, have gone to over £30,000 of taxpayers' money. I mean, I'm sort of laughing, but it kind of beggars belief, doesn't it?
Well, this is what happens when you create a whole set of laws or a whole set of bureaucracies. You know, business and an industry will form around it, and people will use it, and they'll use the arguments to get out of things. And that's all perfectly legal. I think now people are starting to question it, and it's clear that it needs some reform. It's very clear that it needs reform. And, you know, it's interesting that, for instance, when Kemi Badenoch criticized these decisions, you know, judges hit back and said, you know, don't question our impartiality.
Don't question the judges. We can't ever. I was told as a young journalist at the BBC, don't ever criticize a judge on air. And I just sort of thought, what? I mean, they're human too. They make mistakes, and it's perfectly legitimate, especially for Kemi Badenoch, who's the leader of the opposition, and the Prime Minister, who himself was the chief prosecutor of this country, to say, actually, judge whoever, you got it wrong. That's called free speech.
Yes, and there's a tension growing between, you know, democratically elected politicians and the legal profession, especially over these issues of asylum seekers and immigration, where politicians don't feel that they can enact what they were elected to do, what the people want them to do, and they're sort of suffering the consequences of not being able to do it. And then there's judges who are making decisions outside of that, and there's a huge conflict brewing between it, and it's not easily reconciled, like things like, for instance, you know, prisoners' voting rights was a number of years ago.
Well, that was one of the things David Cameron actually did very well, where he said, actually, this is a ruling and we're going to completely ignore it. Let's talk about another legal issue, which is, you were hinting at a second ago. This is Hassan Abu Haleh, who's 39. He assaulted, in fact, he's a sex offender, a 19-year-old woman. He suffers from PTSD after being tortured, his lawyers say, and jailing him would be very dangerous. And he may have sexually assaulted a teenager, but putting him in prison would breach his human rights. He drove around at 3 o'clock in the morning looking for vulnerable, drunk women. He attacked someone 20 years his junior, a 19-year-old woman, and sexually assaulted her. He was due to be sentenced on Monday at Bournemouth Crown Court, but the hearing was adjourned after his defence barrister argued that sending him to prison might breach his human rights. What, I mean, where do you even start with that, Candice?
Yeah, I mean, that's reason gone mad, isn't it? I mean, technically, he can offer that defense. I mean, it's obvious that it's there, but most people would disagree that that is not just. And, you know, if you were to take human rights law out of it and he was just to be tried under ordinary circumstances, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just saying this as a layperson, you know, how much would that be taken into account? What trumps what? And I think it's really good that people are starting to scrutinize these decisions now, because ultimately law has to be respected by the people, or it's not legitimate.
And there has to be the principle somewhere along the way that if you infringe someone else's human rights, such as that woman's complete right to walk along, I don't care how drunk she was, you know, completely unharassed, completely free to go home, as so many people do after nights out. Instead, she was sexually assaulted by this absolute thug. What about her human rights? What about her trauma? What about her PTSD potentially after such an attack? And these things just aren't thought about in the same way. And there's so many people who feel, as I feel in this particular case, that the rights of the victim have been trumped by the rights of the perpetrator.
Oh, and they so are. And I think, we've only just started to understand exactly what victims go through. I mean, there's all the obvious things, but then they can become re-traumatized, for instance, when their attackers are released early. And I think that I think victim impact statements do try and get a hold of that. But no one should be able to claim that their PTSD in some way justifies them behaving violently like that against another person. I mean, that's just pure malevolent behavior. And I think things have gotten all topsy-turvy and upside down when that can be used as a justification for more lenient behavior, because it's not.
Candice, thanks for your analysis. Thanks for your thoughts there. That is Candice Holdsworth, who's a writer and broadcaster, giving us her thoughts on that.